Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm so glad that you are here joining with me today for this Spouse Link live stream, the last one that we're going to be having here in May. Very excited to be here. Um, this is going to be such an amazing conversation. I am very excited about it because as transition nears, there's more and more items that are getting checked off the list of services, programs, and benefits that are no longer accessible to you and your family, things that you've been really used to. And so those feelings can sometimes be very overwhelming and seriously challenge your mental wellness and resiliency of military spouses. Now, in a 2020 article, today's guest, Jennifer Barnhill, who is a military family journalist and researcher, asked this question. She said, "Why does it feel like we as military spouses are an afterthought?" And that article was a precursor to an independent study that she conducted on the relevancy of military spouse groups and kind of that sense of belonging and community. The survey results were published in March of 2022, was what I saw, and it gave insight into what Barnhill refers to as an unsustainable paradigm of military spouses being expected to volunteer their time to be a source of support for others. Now, I would add that I believe that that same kind of unsustainable paradigm exists during retirement and transition, where finding a DoD-sponsored program designed to support an actual military spouse simply does not exist in hardly any locations. So today, during our Spouse Link live stream, we're just going to be discussing how retirement transition can create that significant void of community, Jennifer's survey results, and the much needed changing narrative of the relevancy and importance of military spouses in the military world. So I'm excited to have this conversation with Jennifer. We've got a lot of people jumping on. Hi, Jared. I'm so glad that you're here with us. And Kendra, same as you. So glad that you're able to jump on with us today. If you have questions during the live stream, please feel free to drop them in the comments. This is a super interactive, very relaxed conversation that we're going to be having today. So we'd love your input. We'd love your comments. We'd love your questions. Feel free to drop them in. We look forward to having them. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pull up our slide of Jennifer here. And I'm going to introduce her because I want to get her on as soon as possible so we can just start talking. Jennifer Barnhill is a freelance writer with a focus on military family advocacy. Now, in addition to her independent research and reporting, she is the chief operating officer and lead researcher for Partners in Promise. And I actually had Partners in Promise on last month when we talked about supporting children with special needs through the retirement and transition process. So just kind of a little tie in there. Jennifer serves on the National Military Spouse Network Day of Advocacy Steering Committee, and she is on the board of the League of Wives Memorial Project. Her work on military spouse groups has appeared in Military Families magazine and the War Horse, and she is currently writing a book about the research she has done on military spouses. Lastly, she's a Navy spouse of 15 years and a mother of 3. So I am going to, without further conversation, bring Jennifer on and say hi and get the conversation started.
Hi.
Hi, Jennifer. So glad to have you on today.
Thanks for having me. It's always weird to hear your own bio read back to you.
Right? It is. It's like, oh, wow, I am kind of cool, right? I've done some really interesting things.
That or it's just, obviously showing my heavy reliance on coffee.
Well, tell me you've at least had one cup today. I know you're joining us from the Pacific Coast, so
yes, I have one right here.
Go.
So hopefully everyone else has their coffee too.
Right. I love it. Well, Jennifer, let's kind of just jump right into the conversation. I think that just backing up a tiny little bit, when I read the executive summary of your findings, that was really what spurred me to reach out to you, because it was something that when I read it, I felt very deeply connected to what you were saying. And I think that a lot of military spouses would feel that way. So I'm going to pop up just the short paragraphs that I wanted to share with everyone. Just read this really briefly. So, and this is you speaking. You wrote these words right here. But it talks about the active duty to civilian transition and talks about how it's linked to loss of resource, employment, community, and connection, which is, I think, something that we identify very well with as both active duty and retiring or retired spouses for sure. But it was that last paragraph where you say, historically, military spouses have stepped in to fill these gaps in belonging and in belonging by creating their own communities. And that's kind of the area that I'm kind of hoping we'll focus on a little bit today. Just the idea that despite all those transitions, the way that we compensate for that is creating community.
It is. It is. So as you talked about, my background, I'm a reporter. So all of this stuff that comes in here that we're talking about today is based on that research and the stories that families share with me. A lot of it is research based. And it's not, I am not, a sociologist or a psychologist, but so much of what the data show is that community and connection. So it's really goes into the emotional component of being a human being. So we're human beings first, and military spouses maybe 20 steps down the road. We have many different ways we define ourselves, but belonging is a huge aspect of what the research that I did, touched upon.
And I think absolutely. And yes, we do want to make very clear, there's neither of us are licensed practitioners of any kind of mental health therapeutic kind of degrees of any kind. This really is just a conversation about Jennifer, who's talked to, I'm guessing, hundreds to thousands of different military spouses, and kind of what each of those people have told them as their personal experience. And then me relying on my personal experience, both as a military spouse and as a transitioned military spouse, now one that's gone through the retirement process and is now living on that other side, like what those feelings are and how that experience happened, and where the gaping holes are that we need to maybe be addressing as a bigger community, to make that process easier, I think, for everyone ultimately in the long run. Yeah. So I'll jump in with my very first question, right? Because I could postulate on that for like a really, really long time, but I don't think that's what we want to do today. So I know your survey largely focused, like we said, on active duty spouses and the support networks that they rely on. But when you talk about the military focused community, it doesn't just end when we retire or transition out of active duty service. So what would you say are kind of two of the big picture truths, I guess I would call them, that you discovered about military focused communities and military spouses during your research?
Yeah. So I'm going to back up a teeny bit. All research or it should start with the focus on what do you want to know? What are you trying to find out? And so for me, this story started with one person, one experience. I was at a spouse group after having lived overseas a few times, and had a wonderful experience. I was at a spouse group, just to fast forward my story. I don't want to, spend too much time there, but we heard that, and one of my new friends from my spouse group had a devastating with one person. Oh, I'm sorry. I just heard an echo. So, it started with one person. She had a devastating diagnosis, and our group was just not ready to care for her. We weren't able to provide the support that she needed because we were all busy doing our own thing. And so it really started, that was the first question that I had. How sustainable are these groups, these support systems that we have historically relied upon for information within the military? And so that was my beginning question. I didn't jump right into surveys or jump right into anything else. I started reporting and asking about different questions and learning about different subpopulations within the military family space. For instance, Gold Star families, female veterans and their experiences and how they made to be or different than male veterans. Talking about food insecurity 2 years ago before it really became what it is right now, where we're very aware of it. So talking to different people and finding out these different patterns. So as I'm approaching, this survey, all of those things are going into that informing those questions. And so you mentioned something earlier, gaps. So for me, I wanted to understand what is the function of these spouse groups? What is the purpose? Because I think a lot of times we see these groups as social, and that's the exclusive function of these groups. But when you dig a little deeper and you look at some of the problems that you're seeing in the community, and lack of information, or there's a lot of resources, but no one knows about them. How are people connecting to these resources? So that's kind of where this survey started, just trying to understand. And then what came from it was, but the data speak for themselves, is connection. And so some of the key findings from this survey really talked about belonging, that we don't really belong to either the military itself or the local communities in which we live. I point to the Gold Star here, Blue Star families. Their survey often talks about belonging, and I believe their current survey is out right now, and they're still asking questions about belonging because it really does matter. And the findings that I had, and that you can see in the infographic, we're talking about, how did your participation in these groups was there a connection to your feelings of belonging or your feelings of relevance within the military community? Because as that executive summary highlighted, we have these transitions all the time, and we don't necessarily have the same community or stability across these things. So we identify in some form or fashion with this lifestyle, with each other. We have similar experiences. So the reason some people find these spouse groups to be fulfilling is that they're able to relate to one another and belong. Not everyone found belonging in those groups, and that was okay. They indicated that they participated in maybe a church group or a PTA or their work friends. The main theme was, if they found a place to belong within the community, they were more satisfied with the community. And so that was really not groundbreaking, but I think it has never been examined within the military spouse groups function specifically. We talk about belonging, but it's in the context of different things. And so when we're talking about surveys and looking at military spouses and our experiences, often it's through the lens of how we relate to the active duty service member. And this is especially relevant in this conversation as we're talking about transition, because once that service member is no longer active duty, well, then how do we belong as a transitioning spouse? And that is although not what I focused on in this survey, the overall themes can definitely apply. And so the other idea that I touched upon in this research and then in others is, we have control of our narratives. We may not have control over the benefits. We may not have control over the military side of things, but we do have control over our narratives. So when people felt connected, whether they felt they belonged, whether or not, chicken or the egg, which is always hard, which one comes first? Did you feel like you belonged because you liked the community, or did you belong and therefore you like the community? It's really hard to know, but those things have a relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of weeks ago, I did have a licensed counselor of social work on, who did talk about the impact of belonging. And one of the things she said that just has stuck with me, she said, is when you don't feel that connection to a community, when you don't have that, she said the physical impact is like you're smoking 15 cigarettes per day. Like, there is an actual physical impact to that lack of belonging and that lack of not having that community, and the depression or the sadness or the loneliness, I guess, that comes from that lack of belonging. So I see this, and like you said, although your focus wasn't specifically on retiring spouses or families, but that it's pervasive across the community because of the transitions that we're going through, because of all of the, it's hard to go from community to community to community and find your place. And sometimes it's frankly, it's exhausting, right?
Yeah.
I mean, one PCS move, you might have the energy to do it. The next, you're like, I'm just going to hide out in my house by myself for a while. Eventually I'll need a friend, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so in one thing that I think the audience might be interested in is, in the infographic, I did talk about why we participate in these groups. And I'll really quickly touch on that because I know we have other questions. But the primary reason, and this is, it had, well, go back up there. I'll tell you, slow down. Okay, you're right there. Go up a little bit. So types of friendships and satisfaction levels. So if you go down a little bit.
Down a little bit. Okay. Oh, here we go. Yeah.
And then it goes to the why spouses participate. The primary reason for these particular groups was information. And so, that indicated to me that if you're going for information, we know that all spouse groups or the structures are different from service branch to service branch. The way that the Navy does it is different than the way that the Army does it. But the bottom line is they go to these groups often as an information resource. That combined with friendships and social groups, which of course that connection can happen anywhere. But for these particular groups, they really, what they need is, dual. It's information and connection. Now, you don't have to find the connection in these groups. You could find the connection, like I said before, in another group. So for example, for transitioning spouses, you might find connection in your new community where you get to live and plug in and you're stable there. But the information and the resources is the part that is in flux as you're transitioning, whether it's a PCS transition or transitioning to retirement. And then when we talk about the level of friendships and satisfaction, the connections that we make had relationships with satisfaction. People felt that they never really found their, bestie or, their family, as I like to say, the military spouse family, they didn't have as high satisfaction rates. And so it really, we can say there's so many different things that impact it. And this is a starting point. This survey is definitely a starting point. It is not the end all be all of data on this topic, right? We can't say this causes this, but it is a good starting point for people to understand how their story plays out within this community.
Absolutely. And I think that I love what you're saying about narrative, right? That you control your narrative. And so if you're not finding your sense of belonging or community in one place, it's okay to go to another and continue to seek that out. And ultimately, you're the one that has to do it, right? We can't rely on other people to take charge of that for us. And it is difficult. I'm not saying it's easy. It's not like, oh, just get up and go and take care of it yourself. Do that, right? I mean, I know how hard it can be when you're in the state of transition and you've got a to-do list that's 7,000 things long. The last thing on your list is going to be go make a friend or go find your community, right? Because you just feel like it should come more naturally than it does. So this is so interesting to me. All right. So one of your survey findings really talked about what you were just saying, that higher satisfaction, right? So when you talk about these specialty groups and these groups that you spoke with specifically about, like the Gold Star spouses and sorry, I've got the frog in my throat today for some reason. But when you
get the coffee again, we'll get the coffee again.
Yeah, right. Would you lump military spouse or retiring spouses in kind of with those groups? Would you lump them in as kind of like now a spin-off of what your active duty spouses might be experiencing and kind of thrown into a different category?
So in doing reporting, this is not reflected in this survey. So this is, kind of what I've observed in my reporting. There are, and yes, I would definitely, to answer your question quickly, and now to answer it with more words because I have them. Yes, the business of the military is to be operational and to win and prevent and fight wars and all of that. And so often that question that you opened this up with, are we as military spouses an afterthought? Yes, but it's not because of a malicious intent. It's that the structure of the military is to do the mission of the military. It is not necessarily to think of how to evolve the military structure along with society to reflect more modern. It's just, it happens, but it happens a lot slower than we would want, right? We're seeing that happen. It is happening. Our leaders do care and they are working towards modernizing these ideas, but structurally, we are an afterthought. We are not always right there at the highest of levels of the conversation. We might be in some topics, certainly, but when we're talking about Gold Star families, or we're talking about Reserve and Guard families, the constant message that I hear from them is, I felt like I lost who I was when I not only lost my service member, but I lost my community when I became a Gold Star spouse. Or the Reserve and National Guard, we're not really in the military. That's the perception. And because we don't receive the benefits that you do, they feel there's a message being sent that they're taking in. And so the same thing is true in the survey findings. People who felt that their contributions to the military family community were appreciated by leaders had higher levels of satisfaction. So if we feel like we belong into this community, then we're going to own it. We're going to live it. But when we see, with reflected either in dollars or policy, things that don't necessarily make us feel like we're a part of this community, it's a really hard way. You just don't belong. You don't feel like you belong, because you see the pattern. You look at the narrative that you're writing in your head for yourself, that you're saying, oh, well, if they cared about me, I would be allowed to receive this benefit. I would be allowed to do this, or they would have thought of this. They would have asked, whatever the people group is, they would have asked me this. So this is the part of the narrative that we get to write our narratives, because reality, if you were to meet with some of the people who you think maybe are making policies to make changes that impact our families, they're not sitting around thinking, how can I make this harder for families? They're not. They actually love care. They are caring, and they do care. It's just really hard because it's a big bureaucracy, right? So
it is a big bureaucracy. And I think that's important. And I love that you added that in there, that the mission is not to make this as hard as possible. That little mwah, ha, 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 that is not what's going on behind the scenes. And change is slow, which is why conversations like this, your research, your book, is going to be so important. So when we think about that, tell me, what is the evolution that you're seeing, that you, in your opinion, of course, what is the evolution based on your research and all that you see occurring, or that needs to occur for military spouses?
Well, I wish that, okay, so there's two answers to that question. There's what military spouses are doing to fix their own problems, and then there's what the leaders are doing in response to those issues. Military spouses are doing what they always do best. They make it work. And so, for example, I had the pleasure of meeting folks who are working on spouse group issues, and they're learning to message. I think it's the Council for a Military Spouse Group. I'm going to get it wrong, and I'm apologizing to that group. But they are working to provide resources for spouse groups. And so one of the things that they do is advising their groups, hey, let's be reflective of our modern military community. Let's meet at different hours. We're not going to have these coffee talks. Like, we have jobs. The jig is up, right? Like, we're not who we were, in the 50s, and that's okay. And so modernizing those traditions are things that we can do right now. Another thing we can do right now is be the bridge. And that's something I was hoping to communicate to, later on in this message, was you, as the person who's transitioning, get to be the bridge. You get to inform and bridge that gap for the person who's already retired or transitioned. You can be that person for them. And you can inform the people who are not even close to thinking about it, of like what this looks like, because we are not in the military. We can be each other's community. There is no reason that I would stop being friends with my friend because their spouse is retired, right? Like, that's preposterous. Right. So military spouses can fix some of the things right now with the individual behavior. And I hope that happens. Structurally, it's a harder, conversation. It's getting an acknowledgement of a problem. That's the first step. Is there a problem? What is the problem? Let's agree on the problem. And I think for the community and belonging, that doesn't necessarily feel like a Department of Defense problem to address. And so, it's interpersonal. So how do we talk about that? We talk about it, right? That's exactly how we deal with it. We talk about it like this.
Yeah. So is there a place to go to affect that change then? I mean, because yes, we talk about it, but talking is not necessarily action in that sense. And I know there's a lot of people that would love to. So is it, hey, I'm gonna start a work friendly type of event situation where, I recognize that a military spouse might have a job or, does this or does that so that those 1950s stereotypes of the way that we live are, not part of the equation, and I'm going to do something different. Is it, what we're saying here then is it left up now back to the military spouse to come up with these solutions, or are we looking to rely on someone else? If it's not the DoD's problem, whose is it? I mean, again, this is, I don't expect you to have all the answers, but
Well, I have a lot of thoughts. I mean, not that they're my thoughts, and they're based on conversations like, so this research was, 1 point. I then started doing qualitative research, interviewing family or spouses directly, and getting to know their motivations for volunteerism, their participation in these groups, what needs they're filling. And so it's what I'm about to say is informed by those conversations. And so it is the model currently to have military spouses fix our own problems. That is the model, because we do not belong to the Department of Defense. Like we have a voice within this organization. We absolutely do. But we are not technically part of the military. Their primary mission is not this. And that's okay. It doesn't, that is what they do is important.
Yeah.
But that's why it's up to us to inform our leaders where there are gaps, because they do care. The model currently is to have military spouses elevate their concerns, and then that's exactly what happens. They are responsible to share when things are not working. A solution to that could be improved or increased surveying locally by the installations. That's one way that could be corrected. Kind of a touchy-feely one that I really am a passionate advocate of is removing dependent from paperwork, because it sends that narrative. The narrative it sends is so negative. In my research, I found out what the history of the word dependent, and it means to hang from. And this is a very dangerous term in that way, because even if you're not thinking about this, what does that mean? And so when you think of to hang from, I think of PCSing, and I hang up a picture on the wall, right? If the wall is not strong enough, or the anchor is not strong enough, the nail is not strong enough, the picture is going to fall. If I decide to so it's asking the service member to be stronger, and it's asking the family to be lighter, because if there's an imbalance in that weight ratio, everyone's going to suffer. And so when we are talking about hanging from, that's not who we are anymore. Not that ever was who we were, but it is definitely not who we are now. And so there's my soapbox. Get rid of dependent from paperwork is one of those solutions.
Well, and it is little things like that do make a big difference ultimately in the long run, because so much of it is just mindset, tradition, stereotype, the way we've always done it. I mean, we all know, right? Like a bureaucracy takes forever to make those changes. So those little tiny mindset changes of saying the word family member instead of dependent go a really long way, both for the well-being of the family member and to the mindset of the people that we're working with or trying to have a relationship with that are part of that DoD arena in that sense. So, oh God, I love
family member is a relationship. It's a belonging.
Yeah. Oh,
dependent is a status. Okay. And so you think about it as we're talking about transitioning to veteran status. You belong if you're a family member, even if you're a retired family member, you belong. You have then sent a message of belonging. So it's not just, so when I say this is informed by data, it's not just like, oh, I hate that word. It always grates on me when I hear about it or I read it on a piece of paper. It is a message, and you get to change the narrative if you change the paperwork. And if you, as a military spouse, for me, I don't know if anyone noticed, but in the introductory bio, I put my status as a mother and military spouse last, because I have done things that are not just reflective of my status as a spouse. I belong to my family, but who I am is not just a military spouse. Like, and I imagine that that's part of what we're dealing with as we transition. How do we redefine ourselves? So if we stop labeling ourselves first as these things that are extra, we might be able to kind of own that narrative and move forward in a better way for us that gives us we have identity, and we're not worried about that transition as much because we found our identity in a different thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that a lot of military spouses do have an identity that are in different things, but it doesn't necessarily. What surprised me, I think, about my transition when I say my transition from an active duty military spouse to now a retired military spouse was, despite having so many other things that I do with my time and how I identify myself, feeling like I was losing that one very massive, very long, a huge part of my life. Half my life has been spent in this role or capacity, and feeling like that was going away and there wasn't something that could fill that void was incredibly difficult for me. Like it was one of the biggest, the more shocking pieces of transition. Something I did not expect was the deep sense of sadness and loss I felt when I was like, can I call myself a military spouse anymore? Do I have a place? Will I still, I don't belong with active duty anymore, and losing it's exactly what you're talking about, losing that sense of community and belonging and that, and thus not feeling like my value is no longer there to give. Now,
Can
since
I ask
then,
you a question?
yeah,
Can I ask you a
please.
question?
Absolutely.
So because of that, who made you feel that way? What made you feel that way?
Oh, it was all me. It was all in my own head. It was me reanalyzing and thinking, okay, so as an active duty spouse, and this is one of the things you mentioned earlier, right? As an active duty spouse, I have benefits in this area, this area, this area. I can go here. I belong to this. If I want to go, I can do it because I'm active duty. Now, as a retired spouse, it came, do they allow retired spouses? Does that service extend to a retired spouse? Can I still go to this location and utilize it? Am I allowed to use the gyms still on post? Which is what I have been doing for the last X number of years versus do I have, moving out of that community and finding a new one in the civilian world, right? So it really came down to, first, lack of information. I didn't know, and I didn't know where to go to find that information out. And then second, I think it just came down to there just isn't a great support system that allows that transitioning spouse to understand that there is a community after. It's not like we're cutting you off and you're gone forever. There's more that we can offer. And you've mentioned it a couple of times, right? That's kind of I'm going to throw our next question up because we're going to lead right into it, right? Which is there a role for that retiring transitioning spouse in that evolution? Right.
Yeah.
And I think we both said yes.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that that's kind of, I alluded to the answer earlier is like being that bridge. I hate that we do have to rely on ourselves to fix our own problems, but no one else is looking.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily unique to our life. That's how any kind of issue works. We see all the things that are happening in the civilian world, and I'm not even going to go into all the things that are happening right now, but when we see problems, it starts with someone. If not me, then who? Right. Yeah. And so it is our problem. We can own it. It doesn't mean we have to be alone. We need allies. We need people to take up our causes, certainly. But it is up to us to share our voices through surveys, even if it's not you like starting your own nonprofit, right? You can partner with other organizations. You can lend your voice to surveys. You can, just share your experiences with a neighbor. It's that bridging that gap, not only internally from during the transitions, but bridging the military civilian gap. Like there is a role. It's like we're ambassadors. No one else is looking to fix our problems but us. And there are now people who have taken up our causes. There are legislators who care. There are Department of Defense officials who care, and each service branch has passionate advocates. One of them, I had the pleasure of meeting a few of them in DC recently. I got to meet Mrs. Shereen Brown of the Air Force in person. There are people who really do care, and they ask great questions, and they're trying to inform change. And so it's up to us to kind of be the bridge and to take the ownership of like, okay, I have to be a part of fixing a little bit of this problem myself. It doesn't mean I have to do it all alone, and you aren't alone. But if you see, Anna, like that you are missing information, that's what you said before, you didn't have the information. Okay, well, that is something that the DoD can work on, right? Yeah. We can say, DoD, we need to have some clarity on these websites of who's eligible. Do I count now? Like, make it more clear, because this is that's a low-hanging fruit type of item. If there's a lack of awareness, we can fix that. There's the transition assistance program is there for military spouses as well. Maybe we don't participate as much because we don't think it applies to us, but that's where we can plug in, inform, like where is there a missing piece? What pieces are missing? My husband's active duty right now. I wish I had more insight into that particular transition, but the same patterns are there. You see it when you move as PCS, you have to start over. You have to reach out. Do you wish that people would reach out to you and make it easier for you? Absolutely. And sometimes they do. Sometimes they do, and that's great. But sometimes they don't. And that's really hard, especially if you're like an introvert and it's not your, that's not your comfort zone. It's really not easy.
It is. And kind of very similarly to what you were saying, where, the word dependent is kind of like a hot button for you. One of those for me now, and I didn't recognize it until I went through the retirement and transition process. But one of my hot buttons is that general, we serve military spouses too from organizations. And then me having to call them and say, do you serve retired? Because they'll serve the veteran population, but not necessarily the spouse or family member still connected with that veteran. And that's one of my, I'm like, just make it really clear for me. Tell me if it's active, retired, veteran. I need to know exactly who it is that you're talking
about. Now I have a plan for you, Anna. I have a plan for everyone who has transitioned. So the Blue Star Families research talks about the lack of connection between the civilian world and the military world, active duty or veteran, right? They don't know anything about either one. Wouldn't it be amazing if military spouses who are retired or transitioned made it their mission to be in those local communities and educate them about what it's like? Because we as active duty spouses, we're just trying to how it is. You're keeping your head above water during deployments, and Murphy's visiting you every other day and all the things, right? And not to say that doesn't happen when you transition. It absolutely does. But wouldn't it be great if that was something that we fixed our own problems, but in a way that really just built community and belonging? That, because in doing that, you're then building your own local community. You're also being that bridge. And that is huge for your narrative. You get to be a part of fixing a problem that you encountered and fix it for people coming behind you.
And honestly, Jennifer, that's what these spousing live streams, that's how they started, was them reaching out to me about doing some ambassador type work just to the general community, and me saying, listen, this is where I want to focus, because I see such a gaping hole where people need this information. We need to have these conversations. We need to be talking about the feelings that are coming with this, as well as the tangible things that we need, like information and resources to help support those journeys for the military spouses. And I mean, ultimately that translates to the whole military family, right? I mean, it's not just the spouse. That trickle down definitely is happening. So, okay. So Jennifer, give me your one last big piece of advice. What's your last piece of advice you would offer to a military spouse as far as that loss of community or moving forward? I mean, it can be a recap of what you've already said, but I'd love to hear, what's your one thing you want to leave everybody with today?
Don't start another nonprofit. No, I mean, there's just so many people doing great work in this community, and there's so many places that you can belong, and they're comprised of active duty spouses, veteran spouses. This community does not care about your status, and you can belong because you can inform the things that people are doing to fix these problems. So I would just say, I'm just joking about don't form another nonprofit. You do you, and that's fine. But just know that there's so many other groups out there probably working on similar things that maybe you might also be passionate about.
Yeah.
And you can plug in any number of ways, whether it's volunteerism, which is, if it's on your terms, I'm all for it. You should never feel pressured, but find your community, whatever that looks like. And that way you get, if you find your community, you're writing that narrative for yourself that ends up being more positive. Because it's easy. It is so easy in this life to see the negative parts of it because it is hard. It's not to say other people don't have it hard too, but if we're seeing it as the big bad military is taking my spouse away again, they took away my opportunity to be this employee. I couldn't work in my field. I lost, now I'm losing my benefits as I transition. If that's the narrative that that you're walking away from, of course that's a negative. The military doesn't want that, messaging out into the world. So let's talk. Let's keep it going. Let's have these conversations. Talk to nonprofits. Plug into the community while you're still here so that we can address these conversations. Because once you're out of it, if you leave, we lose that information. We lose that insight. And so keep talking to us. Don't leave the active duty community. Don't let us not pay attention to to the things that you're dealing with, because it's easy to not hear a story if we're not talking about it. And so let's keep talking about it.
Yeah. And I want to encourage anyone who's listening to the replay or listening live right now, the conversation is happening on LinkedIn. I want to have that conversation. I'm just going to say it flat out, right? I am here to have this kind of conversation. This is the thing that ignites that passion that makes me want to, get up out of bed every day and come do something for my fellow military spouses in whatever stage of their military journey that they might be, whatever phase of life, however they're feeling it as far as that goes. So I love that advice to, don't just walk away feeling defeated or that you have nothing left to offer. We absolutely need your voices as far as that goes. I love that.
Yeah, we can't fix the problem if we don't know about it. So keep talking.
Yes. Jennifer, what a fantastic conversation today. We touched on so many different areas. Did we solve the world's problems? No, of course not. But you're like, wait a second. Yes, we did.
Yes, we did.
But I do feel like it's such an important step in moving forward and moving in progressing, right? In making those actionable items actually start happening. So before we go today, I want you to, I'm going to add this up here. Can you tell people how they can connect with you if they'd like to reach out and talk to you more?
Yeah, so I am a writer. Social media is a thing. I know that people are better at Twitter and I'm supposed to be on Twitter and all the things. If you want to have a conversation with me, start with messaging me on LinkedIn. I will check it there. That's the best place because then I can share my email. It's a conversation. I like talking to people because that's how I do all of the work that I do. So, connect with me on LinkedIn. Any of those handles, great, but you're probably not going to see me inundating your, boxes with posts and memes and all that. So feel free to connect, reach out, and ask any questions about the data. Partners in Promise, we have a lot of data on military students in special education. We love data, we love the stories, and we want to hear from people who maybe don't feel heard from. So please, reach out and connect.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Well, Jennifer, I just want to say one last time, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you everybody for jumping in. There was a very healthy comment discussion happening on LinkedIn. I couldn't even hardly keep up with it and actually pay attention to what we were talking about. So I pulled some comments where I could, but if you're really interested in kind of seeing what some of the people that were listening today were saying, I'm just going to recommend you jump on the LinkedIn show and take a peek at it. And, just take a look and see what everyone is thinking in terms of, all of these amazing things that this whole idea of loss of community or finding your place, belonging and next steps in the conversation. So, Jennifer, thank you again so much. And then next month, I will be coming back with 2 more Spouse Link live streams. So keep an eye. If you're not connected with me on LinkedIn, I would love to have you. I did drop 2 links into the comment of all the places that we're streaming. So the first link is for Spouse Link, which is the organization that is sponsoring and supporting these live stream conversations. And Spouse Link is a fabulous place to find resources for any stage of military life. It's blogs, it's got people you can reach out to. There's community events that are happening, all sorts of kinds of things that you can look for on Spouse Link. And so that link is directly in there. The other one I wanted to pull in specifically for military spouses going through that retirement or transition process is going to be the Military One Source My Step program. And it's called Stepping Beyond. And it's just got short little snippet videos that talk a little bit about some of the things that are going on. Now, it is not the end all be all for the information resource, but it is a great place to start. And so if you're floundering with even a place to start and you're nearing that transition portal, connect with me, go check out that Military One Source My Step, Stepping Beyond. And you can click that link and get there right away. So, all right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We will see you next month. Jennifer, thank you so much and have a wonderful day.
Thanks for having me.